Hello there, Rex third grade scholars. It's me, Mrs. Z, back at it again for another reading video. I'm going to share my screen with you, and then we will get started. So as you can tell today, it is mini lesson number 1, and we are going to be working on story elements. Now, story elements are something you have probably heard of before. We did work with them in kindergarten, first, and second grade, although you guys weren't here for kindergarten, maybe not even here for first, but they are something that we should have at least heard before and be familiar with. Here's our essential question for today. Why do stories have story elements? Why would a story have story elements? Good question. Let's come back to it in a little bit. So in third grade, we're going to be using this graphic organizer, both when we are breaking down stories that we are reading in class, as well as when we are creating our own stories in writing. It looks like this. It says story map. The title is going to be whatever the title of the book that you're reading is, or the title of the piece of work that you are creating. Author, whoever is writing the book. It also has characters, setting, when and where, a little foreshadowing for what's about to come up. And then down here, these are going to be the events in your story, what happens in the beginning, in the middle, and again at the end. Let's talk about characters. So a character is who the story is about, and a story can have more than one character. For example, in our book, Dinosaurs Before Dark, Jack and Annie are both our characters. There are, in fact, 2. So some stories will have only one, but most stories will have multiple characters. And then there's usually a main character or main characters, which is who is the story mostly about. And then there's just kind of other side characters that aren't as important. But for just now, a character, who the story is about, in this book, Jack and Annie. Next, we have our setting. So setting is when. Do not forget the time. It is very important. Time can mean a specific time, like 4:30 in the afternoon. It could also be much more general, like before dark. It could be much more broad, like it could be the 1950s or the 1800s. It could be a large span of time that a book is taking place during. But you do want to make sure that when you're talking about the setting, you do not forget about the time, because it is important. The time and the when of your story is going to dictate how your characters interact, because the way that Jack and Annie might act in the morning might be different than how they act at night. A character from the 1980s might think differently, might act differently than someone who's alive today, or a character that is working in the future, right? So do not forget the time. Don't forget the when. It's very important. And we also want the where a story takes place. This is what most people think of when they think of setting. So where is the physical place? Where in this world or in another world is this story taking place? What is the environment that our characters are interacting with? In this example, the story takes place in the prehistoric era. That's the when, that's the time. It's a kind of a large chunk of time, but that's the time. And Frog Creek, Pennsylvania is the only place that is mentioned by name in the book for being our setting. But we don't really know exactly if Jack and Annie stayed in Frog Creek, Pennsylvania when they went back in time. It doesn't tell us specifically, but it is likely that that is what happened. Next, we have events. Events are pretty simple. What happens? What happened? What problem or problems do our characters face? And how do they solve them? Now, in kindergarten, first and second grade, we just focused a lot on problems and solution. Problem and solution. Those are super important, and please do not forget those things when we are talking about the events or things that happen in our story. However, comma, in 3rd grade, we want to expand upon that. So we're not only including the problem and the solution, we also have this 3rd element in the middle, which is what happened in the middle of that story. Usually, the problem happens close to the front of our story. So what's the problem? First, and that's the word we want to use in 3rd grade, first, Jack and Annie make a wish in a book and travel back in time. Next, what's going on in the middle? It's not necessarily a problem, not necessarily the solution. It's kind of what's connecting those two things. Next, they meet a lot of dinosaurs. You could get more specific and say that a T-Rex chased Jack. You could get more specific and say that they rode a pteranodon. But generally speaking, next, they meet a lot of dinosaurs. Last, here is our solution. How do our characters solve their problem? Last, Jack and Annie make a wish in a book and return home, right? So why do stories have these story elements? There should be a lot of answers to this question, and one of the beautiful things about essential questions is there is no right or wrong answer. So just take a moment, think in your own head, why do stories have story elements? Did you come up with your idea yet? All right, I'm going to share mine. So if you are still thinking about your idea, pause this video, come back to it. So why do stories have story elements? Stories have story elements, in my opinion, because it helps us to organize our story. It tells us what order we want to tell our story in. It helps the author to organize their thoughts, and it helps the reader to kind of digest what the author is trying to tell them. In almost every story, one of the first thing that happens is you meet a character. Almost every time it's on the first page of a book. Not always, but almost every time. The second thing that's going to happen in almost every story is you find out your setting. You're going to find out when and where is this story taking place, because as an author, that helps you to set up how your characters are going to interact with that world and what's going to happen. And as a reader, it helps us to get our brain set to figure out what kind of story we think we're going to be reading. If I know that my character is a grown-up, let's say I know my character is a grown-up and they're on a vacation, and the setting is in a really old spooky castle in the 1990s, okay? And I know that there's a big storm going on outside, right? That all sounds kind of spooky, which tells me as a reader, I might be about to read a scary story, right? So I'm just getting my brain warmed up for that. Then we have the event. So after our author tells us our character and our setting, then we can get on with what our story is actually happening. So when we break things down into our story elements, it helps the author organize the story they're going to tell and how they're going to tell it. And it helps the reader better understand the story that the author is trying to tell us. Well, you might come up with a different answer to this essential question, and that's totally okay. All right, so now let's put all of our elements into our graphic organizer. Below this, right below this, you are going to see this graphic organizer. I will also link as a PDF in case the Google Doc isn't quite working the way we want to. And I would like you to fill out this entire thing based on the book Dinosaurs Before Dark. Now, if you've been paying attention, I already gave you like all of the answers. So feel free to get this paper ready and to pull up the video and go back and watch it again. Because as you fill this out, You will also be filling out our story elements, and then you'll be working more with Mr. Dowd in writing on how we're going to use those same story elements when we are writing. Remember, we have a character, we have our setting, then we have our events. Beginning, what happens in the middle, and what happens at the end. I hope that you guys had fun learning with me, and I will see you all, well, in our next reading video. Bye.